Hours after a conversation, your brain produces the perfect reply and uses it as proof that the sentence you actually said was bad. At the time, that original answer seemed ordinary enough. The exchange continued. The other person responded, and nothing supplied a clear verdict. Later, one cleaner line appears, and the live version suddenly sounds worse than it did when it left your mouth. The comparison feels fair because both sentences came from you, but they were produced under two very different conditions. One had to exist inside a moving conversation. The other arrived afterward, with time, silence, and the ending already known. Why does the edited line feel like evidence that you failed, rather than evidence that editing is easier than speaking live? The feeling that follows is not a recording of the conversation. It is the brain making a claim about what the conversation meant. That claim could come from at least three different places. Maybe the live brain was overloaded and the better line only became possible once the timing pressure disappeared. Maybe the later replay is exaggerating a pause, a face, or a tone that never carried the verdict you assigned to it. Or maybe the original words created a real consequence outside your head, something that genuinely deserves attention. All three can feel equally intense from the inside, so the strength of regret cannot tell you which explanation is correct. Therefore, the first test is mechanical rather than emotional. Before judging the sentence, measure how little time ordinary conversation gave the brain to understand, plan, and answer. Ordinary conversation gives the brain almost no clean moment in which to finish listening and then calmly build a reply. It has to understand the other person, decide what matters, choose words, control tone, and monitor the reaction while the exchange is still moving. The average gap between speakers is only about 200 milliseconds. Preparing even one new word generally takes at least 600 milliseconds, and producing a simple sentence takes roughly 1500. The available pause is shorter than the work required. To keep the conversation flowing, listeners can begin planning an answer as soon as they grasp the point, sometimes several seconds before the other person finishes. That means part of your reply is being constructed from an unfinished sentence, incomplete social information, and a prediction about where the conversation is going. Sometimes the prediction is right. Sometimes the final words change the meaning after your response is already forming. Seen this way, the original sentence was not a polished conclusion, but a live decision made while several mental jobs competed for the same narrow window. But limited time only explains why the first version was imperfect. It does not explain why the later version feels as though it should have been obvious all along. Once the conversation ends, the reviewing brain gains something the live speaker never had: the ending. It knows how the other person responded, how the silence felt afterward, and which detail later became suspicious. Hindsight then rebuilds the scene around that known result, making certain clues look brighter and more useful than they were in real time. A pause that was ambiguous becomes a warning. An ordinary expression becomes something you were apparently supposed to decode immediately. Meanwhile, the late reply is created with extra evidence, no turn-taking pressure, and as many revisions as necessary. It can be shortened, softened, sharpened, and tested privately before anyone has to hear it. The result feels obvious because the brain quietly includes information that only became available after the original sentence was already spoken. That does not prove the first response was harmless or that the replacement would have worked better. It explains why the missed opportunity looks cleaner in retrospect. But an edited line becomes painful only when the brain adds an audience verdict, the assumption that the other person noticed the mistake exactly as strongly as you did. Your own embarrassment feels enormous because you have access to every hesitation, every bodily jolt, and every interpretation attached to it. Other people usually receive far less information: a sentence, a pause, an expression. Then the conversation keeps moving. In the classic embarrassing shirt experiment, participants predicted that about 46% of observers would identify the shirt. Only about 23% actually did. The shirt was visible. The humiliation was simply less central to everyone else than it was to the person wearing it. Conversation creates a similar mismatch when nervousness or hesitation feels as though it must have leaked out in full. Evidence from laboratory conversations, workshops, and college dorms found that people systematically underestimated how much their partners liked them. In some groups, that liking gap persisted for months. This does not mean nobody notices awkwardness. It means your internal alarm is a poor measurement of how large the moment appeared from the other side. But if the audience may have registered less failure than you imagined, why can the scene become more negative after the audience is gone? Once the conversation is over, the replay does more than revisit the moment. It begins evaluating it again. In a 7-day smartphone study of 284 people, between 86 and 96% of subjectively embarrassing interactions were followed by some form of post-event processing. So replay after an awkward moment is extremely common, and its presence alone does not prove that anything unusual or clinically serious is happening. Each pass can pull forward a hesitation, a badly timed word, or the expression you are least certain you understood. Then the brain compares that selected version with alternatives created later under easier conditions. The external event stays the same, but the rating attached to it can keep changing. After enough repetitions, familiarity starts to feel like confirmation. The scene is easier to imagine. The negative explanation is easier to retrieve, and certainty rises. Accuracy may not. No new reaction, message, or consequence has entered the loop. The same uncertain material has simply been inspected from the same self-critical angle again. Therefore, assist in this common probably has a useful function, but only when replay produces a specific correction rather than another general verdict against the speaker. A replay system becomes useful when an imagined alternative changes what you do in the next similar moment. Counterfactual thinking is not merely inventing a better sentence. It can connect a past outcome to one precise adjustment. Across 3 experiments, those imagined alternatives accelerated future behavioral intentions, only when the intention specifically matched the alternative. I should ask what they meant before answering can shape a later decision. I should somehow become less awkward gives the brain nowhere to go. Useful reflection extracts a correction and reaches an endpoint. Gentle self-judgment keeps looping because it never defines what should change or what would count as success. Once replay stops producing a usable correction, another pass can intensify the accusation without improving the next response. But a useful lesson does not prove the original event was harmless. Some regret remains after every bias correction because another person was genuinely affected. Sometimes the replay is not inventing the problem. It is pointing toward evidence that exists outside the replay itself. The words may have been clearly hurtful. The other person may have shown an observable reaction, or the conversation may have produced a consequence that continues after the moment ends. A similar comment may also belong to a repeated pattern rather than one isolated sentence. Those signals do not require perfect access to the other person's mind. They give regret something concrete to track. Even then, hindsight can exaggerate what was obvious, and self-focused attention can enlarge how completely the mistake defined the interaction. Bias and genuine harm can occupy the same conversation. Responsibility may require acknowledgement or repair, but prolonged self-punishment does not become more useful simply because the original mistake was real. Therefore, regret cannot be treated as either a verdict or meaningless noise. Its value depends on what information the feeling actually contains. Post-conversation regret is not one clean signal. It mixes the original live sentence, a reconstructed memory, a polished alternative, and guesses about what the other person experienced. Each part may contain useful information, but none becomes reliable simply because the feeling is strong. Regret becomes more informative when it identifies something specific, words that were clearly hurtful, an observable consequence, or a repeated pattern that exists beyond the replay. It can also be useful when the imagined alternative produces a matching future adjustment, rather than a vague demand to become a better person in general. The signal weakens when repetition only hardens the same unsupported conclusion. Therefore, the intensity of regret is not the verdict. The information it adds is what determines whether the feeling deserves repair, learning, or less authority. The sentence from the opening has not changed, but the replay surrounding it now means something very different. Hours later, the perfect reply appears again. But now, it is easier to see what produced it. More time, a known ending, and no one waiting for an immediate answer. The original sentence remains exactly where it was spoken live, under pressure, before the speaker knew what the moment would become. If something outside the replay shows that harm was done, the late reflection may point toward repair. If nothing new appears, repeating the scene more forcefully does not turn suspicion into evidence. The other person may remember the sentence, interpret it differently, or barely return to it at all. Your replay cannot recover that answer from inside your own memory. The late reply may still be useful, but arriving later does not make it the correct answer.